Hey everyone, and welcome back. My name is Mackenzie, aka Astromac, and I'm a professional astrologer, and I'm here to talk all things astrology with you. And today I want to continue our conversation all about the astrology ABCs, being the planets, the signs, the houses, and the aspects. And this will be a continuation of part one, where I covered the planets and the signs in astrology, and I briefly introduced the houses, but today we are diving deep into the houses and the aspects in astrology. And these astrology ABCs, or do-re-mis, being the planet, signs, houses, and aspects, they're like the basic building blocks of astrology that really set the foundation from which, chart interpretation and chart synthesis and just understanding astrology in general, it really lays that foundation from which all of that can be built on. And so having like a strong understanding of these foundations can really, make you a better astrologer in the long run. So if you haven't watched part one of my Astrology 101 yet, then I would go back and watch that because that'll help make this video make much more sense. I also wrote an Astrology 101 ebook where I broke things down in simple and easy to understand language, and I tried to use lots of analogies and examples, and so patrons get that free with their membership. And if you don't feel like joining my Patreon, then you can also purchase it off of my Patreon. But this part one and now part two of this Astrology 101 will follow that guide, and so if you want a nice visual, then be sure to check that out. And so now, before we dive into the houses and the aspects, let's briefly go back and try to summarize what I covered in part one. And so we went over the planets and the signs. And so the planets are the what in astrology, like what energy is at play and what area of consciousness is expressing itself. And they represent different areas of our psyche. And each planet represents a very specific part of ourselves and part of our makeup. And in my ebook, I describe them as like they are the actors in this stage or this play of life. And each actor, again, represents a different area of our consciousness. So like the sun is our inner essence, and it's that spirit that just animates our physical body. And then the moon is our emotions and our emotional reactions and what we need to feel emotionally safe. And then Mercury is our thinking and our communication, and Venus is our wants and our needs and our desires and our preferences, like our likes and our dislikes. And then Mars is our, drive. It's what motivates us, and it's the planet of action. And then Jupiter is what, urges us to seek meaning in our life, and it's this planet all about expansion. And then Saturn is that planet all about discipline and responsibility, and so on and so on. You get the idea. Watch part one. And then how these planets or energies are expressing themselves is described by the sign that it's sitting in. So the signs are the how in astrology, and they describe how the energy is expressing itself and like what kind of qualities that planet has. And so in the play of life, the signs are like the character that an actor is playing. Like, is the planet playing a bold and fiery and passionate and impulsive character like Aries, or is it playing a more like moody and emotional and intuitive character like Cancer? Or is the planet playing a more like serious and disciplined and responsible and ambitious character like Capricorn? The signs, again, they're just the characters that a planet is playing. You could also think of the signs as like the costume that an actor is wearing, or like a filter that a planet is expressing itself through, or like a lens through how the planet is expressing itself. And that lens really colors how that planet expresses itself. And the signs also color house cusps, because every house has a sign on its cusp. And that's what we're getting into today, is the houses. And, we'll get into the aspects a little bit as well. And this is the part where all the action happens. And it's what really like brings a chart to life, because without the houses, astrology would just kind of be like, floating around in this abstract symbolism. And so houses are what kind of ground astrology into the real world and, bring it into the 3D. And it really personalizes the chart in a more concrete way. So if zodiac signs describe how energy moves and planets describe what energy is moving, then the houses describe where that energy shows up most in your life. And going back to my play analogy, if the planets are the actors, and the signs are the character that actor is playing, or the costume it's wearing. Then the houses are like the stages or the different sets that the actors are acting on. And so the houses are the areas of life where a planet in a sign manifests and expresses itself in someone's life. And so when you were born, it's like the universe took an imaginary picture or like a snapshot of the sky with you at the center at the exact moment and place that you took your first breath. And that imaginary picture is your birth chart. And so your birth chart is like a two-dimensional map of the planet's positions at the exact time and place that you were born from Earth's perspective. And when we look at a birth chart, what we see is a wheel with all kinds of symbols and numbers and lines in it, and it can be really overwhelming and confusing. So I'm trying to break it down in the best possible way that I can explain it. And so your birth chart, or any astrology wheel, is going to be divided into 12 areas or sectors or sections that kind of look like different pizza slices, but they each represent a major area of life. So essentially, the houses provide a dimension of space that allow for the planets and the signs to manifest on this physical plane. And without the houses, there would be no birth charts, because it's the houses that are what connect those like planetary celestial influences and the signs into our real world experiences. And so it's like the houses are what just really anchor in these planetary energies and the signs into more specific areas of life. And again, it just brings a chart to life. And so the houses are a really, really important thing if you're a living being living on Earth. And so each slice or each house corresponds to a specific area of life. And so together, all 12 houses make up all parts of our human experience on Earth, including our identity, our relationships, how we make money, and our career, and our home and spirituality, and anything that you can think of that includes like part of our human experience falls into one of these 12 houses. And the way that I like to explain houses in astrology is to think of them as like different rooms in one big house or in a castle. Like the 12 houses are all in the same chart. And so I like to explain it as, all of these rooms are in one house. And so think of it as like different rooms and how each room has a different function. Like, you're not gonna sleep on your kitchen floor unless you've got something else going on. But like think about how every room in a house has a designated function. And so every house in astrology also has a specific function or area of life that it covers. And how you approach that area of life and how you approach the themes that are associated with a specific house are described by the sign that is on that cusp. And the 12 houses start with the ascendant, which is the sign that was rising up over that eastern horizon at the very moment you took your first breath. And so it's like the entry into every single person's birth chart is this ascendant. And so it's kind of like the gateway into your birth chart. Then all other houses follow counterclockwise, starting from 1 to 12. And it really starts from this very important point being the ascendant, and it really forms a framework that is unique to you and your birth chart in how the planets and the signs manifest in the physical reality, you being that physical manifestation. So this line right here that marks the ascendant actually goes all the way across the chart, and that line is the horizon. And at the ascendant, that is the eastern horizon. So like think about when the sun rises. It rises in the east and it sets in the west. And so over here is the western horizon where the sun sets, and that line right there is the descendant. So your birth chart is laid out in a way where it's like you are right at the center, like in the middle of that horizon. And it's like, imagine that you're also facing south. That's how all of our birth charts are laid out. So everything above that horizon in that top half of the chart is what was visible at the very moment that you were born. And so like if you have your sun in any of those top 6 houses, that means that you were born during the day. And then conversely, everything that's in that bottom half of the chart is what was visible on the opposite side of the world. And so if your sun is in any of those bottom 6 houses, that means that you were born at night. So the top half of your chart, being houses 7 through 12, really represent and deal with the more public matters of life, like our relationships and our career and our social circles, whereas the bottom half of the chart, houses 1 through 6, really deal with more private matters in life, like our sense of identity and our money and siblings and our family and our health. And like I've been saying, each house has a sign on its house cusp that describes how you approach that area of life. And the sign really just like acts as a lens that colors your style and attitude and way of engaging with the themes described by that house. And so you may notice some similarities between like the 12 signs and the 12 houses. Like, Aries in the first house have similarities, and Taurus in the second house, and Gemini in the third house, and so on, all the way through Pisces. But really try to separate them because they are very different things in astrology. Remember, the signs are like these archetypal energies that have qualities and they act as descriptors. Again, think of them as like characters or, their costumes or, lenses and filters. And then, the houses are what make these archetypal energies and these subtle influences real. It's what anchors these signs and these planets into our reality. They really materialize these energies here on Earth. So like, for example, a third house Scorpio sun is going to be very different than a 8th house Gemini sun, because the sun is expressing itself through the third house in one chart, and then it's expressing itself through the 8th house in another. Like, those are going to be very, very different suns. And so again, really try to separate the signs from the houses because they are very different. So the houses are just like these very concrete things that are tied to our experience here on Earth. And so like, for example, if you were born on Venus, you would have, completely different houses, and the houses would represent something completely different because I think it takes like over 200 days for Venus to rotate on its axis, and it takes like 225 days for, Venus to orbit around the sun. So again, the houses are just like a very Earth-centric thing. And so all of this to say, the houses are nothing but a division of the sky as seen from Earth's perspective, or, how we see it from our perspective. And we start off by dividing the chart into quarters or quadrants using the horizon line that runs from east to west and the meridian line, which runs from north to south. And these two lines are very important. As you can see, they form a cross, and that cross is known as the cross of incarnation. And at the very center of that cross is you. And then these two lines, being the horizon and the meridian, they mark the entry into what's known as the angular houses. The ascendant marks the entry into the first house, and the IC is the fourth house, and the DC is the seventh, and the MC is the 10th. And so these first, fourth, seventh, and 10th houses are what's known as the angular houses. And so it's like these angular houses are kind of like these dynamic cornerstones in our birth charts, representing like, they orient us to self, being the first house, and our inner foundation being the fourth house, and our relationships in the 7th, and then our public presence in the 10th. And so these houses are important. It doesn't make them like more important than the rest of the chart, but they are kind of like these prominent spaces in a birth chart. I should also take this time to mention that there are many different house systems that differentiate in how a chart is divided. Like, there are whole sign and equal house systems, which make it so that each house is 30 degrees, they're all equal, but then, there are also these unequal house systems like Placidus or Porphyry or, the Koch system, where the houses are unequal in size depending on like the latitude and longitude that you were born at. And for me, like I use Placidus, and that's just because, first of all, it's how I was taught, and, I've also experimented a bunch with different house systems, and I've just found that Placidus is what works best for me. So don't be afraid to experiment a little bit and, look at your chart in lots of different house systems and just see kind of like what makes most sense for you personally. Like, even though I use Placidus as my primary, house system, I always keep whole sign house system in mind as well, because I do think that there is validity to all different house systems. So like, there's no wrong or right way to divide a chart. Just find what works best for you. And so no matter what house system you're using, every single house has a sign on its house cusp. And so that's why we astrologers say that every single person has every single sign somewhere in their chart, but it just manifests differently depending on, what house the sign is on and if you have any planets in that house or in that sign. So this is where astrology can start to feel a little more complicated, because now we've got this combination of a planet in a sign and now it's in a house. Giving this combination of a planet in a sign in a house many, many different potentials for expression. It's kind of similar to like our genetics or our DNA, where it allows for nurture and free will to be incorporated. Because, I'm not really one of those astrologers who thinks that we've like plotted out and planned out every single thing that we want to experience before we incarnate. I do believe that we incarnate knowing the potential for things to happen though, but it's all based on like our own decision making and on our own free will. It's just like how we were born with a certain set of DNA. We're also born with a certain birth chart, and we can't change our DNA and we can't change our birth chart that we're born with, but what we can do is we can consciously tune into these things and try to influence how these genetics or how our birth chart expresses itself. And this happens through our choices and our free will and what we choose to do and what we choose not to do and how we choose to look at ourselves. And then there's also that nurture aspect and how we were raised and the influences we have in our environments. And so there's a huge spectrum or potential from how all of this can be expressed in our lives. And, we express on that spectrum throughout the course of our lives, sometimes going back and forth, continuously evolving, because it's not like we're the same person we were when we were an infant, Are you with me so far? I know this has probably been a lot to take in, so if you need to pause for a minute and kind of like absorb everything I've been talking about, I don't blame you. Or if you have any comments or questions right now, then be sure to leave them down below, or while you're at it, might as well leave a like and subscribe if you like what I've been saying so far. So now let's finally move on to what each house represents. And I kind of broke things down and I made my own little chart with, key things in each house that you can download for free from my Patreon, or you can screenshot it here, but just a little freebie for you guys. And actually, before we get going, because I know that this is a really common question that tends to come up when people are first starting to learn astrology, but even if a house appears to be empty and there's no planets inside of it, that doesn't mean that you don't have that house or that area of life in your chart. You still have that house inside of your chart, but it just means that there's not necessarily like conscious energy coming through that house or coming through that area of life, but you still have a planet that rules over a house. So that planet will tell us, how you approach that area of life in a more specific way. And so regardless of if you have, empty houses in your chart, every single person has empty houses in their chart, by the way. But, every single person has every single house in their chart, and every person has every single sign in their chart. It just might be that, those empty houses are just not necessarily an area of emphasis for you in your life, or, whatever it might be. And so diving in, let's start at the ascendant. I've kind of talked about it already, but the ascendant or your rising sign is the very start of your first house. And it's that sign that was rising up over that eastern horizon at the very moment that you were born. And so the ascendant is kind of like your lens through how you meet the world, and it really sets the tone for your entire chart. And I actually have already made a video all about the rising sign and the ascendant, so be sure to watch that if you want more information on what the rising sign is. And so remember how I was talking about how houses are like these rooms inside of a big castle, or, a big house. And so the ascendant is kind of like, it's like your front door where you let people in or you don't. And so that includes what you physically look like, and it includes like your first impressions and your general approach to life. And we tend to really identify with these qualities of the sign that was rising up over that eastern horizon, depending on a lot of factors, like if you have any planets in that first house, or if you have planets in a different sign in that first house, or, any planets making aspect to your ascendant. But general rule of thumb, we do tend to identify with these qualities of our first house. And so this first house is like our sense of self. And some astrologers may talk about this first house or this rising sign as like the mask that you put on for the outside world when you enter a new situation. But, I don't really view it that way, because that just feels like false or fake. But, think about when you enter a new situation, like you're not going to act like you do with your besties or like with your family. And a mask is something that like you purposefully and consciously put on. And that's not really the ascendant. It's just kind of like your natural way of how you meet new situations. And so how you do that is dependent on the sign, on that ascendant, and as well as any planets in there. And again, I made a video that went into much greater detail, so be sure to watch that. And that brings us to the second house. And the second house is our house of values and resources, and it's also known as the house of love and money. And so the sign on this house cusp really describes like how you bring in money and how you approach things like self-love and self-worth. And so this house also includes like our sense of security. And so that includes like money and possessions and assets and valuables, and also our values, and also things that we like to collect. I always kind of imagine this house as like our piggy bank that is full of like our talents and our skills and our values and our assets, because it really describes qualities that we already have and are ready to kind of like, harness. And so again, this is the house where we can find our sense of security like in our body. And so that also includes like our self-worth, and with self-worth, that's like what matters most to you, and it's what you value, and it's what you need to feel secure. And when you think about it, a lot of times like how we feel about ourselves kind of dictates what we feel like we deserve, and what we feel worthy of. And so all of that is found in this second house. And so the sign on the second house really describes like what you want and what you need in order to feel secure, and like what makes you feel like you're enough, and what makes you feel safe and happy. And this is also the house that contains our natural skills as well, and like our talents. And it's kind of like it's like our natural resources that we can bring to the world, that you can draw on to bring you security. And then the third house is the house of communication. And so it's how you communicate is described by the sign on this house cusp, and that includes how you communicate your needs in order to stay alive, basically. And so it's also how you share your thoughts and your ideas. And so this is a house that's all about learning and taking in information and how you gather information, and that also includes your attitude to learning and sharing your thoughts and sharing your ideas. The third house is just like a very like busy house where there's like a lot going on. Like it's a very mentally active house where you're taking in information and you're processing it, and you're organizing it in your mind in order to be able to share it, and share your thoughts and share your ideas. And it's a house that's like all about movement. And so I always imagine like it's a house where we're running our errands and going about our local neighborhood, and meeting our like neighbors and our community in that way, because this is a house that is actually associated with our local neighborhoods as well as like our immediate surroundings. And so this house is also the house of our siblings, and also those friends that are like very close, that we're very close to, that we grew up with as well. And speaking of family, that brings us to this fourth house. And like I said earlier, this line that marks that fourth house is the IC, or the Imam Coeli. And this IC marks the lowest point in our chart, representing like the most personal and the most private, and usually the most sensitive part of our chart, and the most sensitive part of ourselves. And so if we're thinking in terms of like, where the sun is in the chart, the IC tends to represent like, the middle of the night, where it's like, it's the darkest point in our chart. And actually for this this meridian line that goes from the IC to the MC, I always envision and I imagine the IC as the roots of a tree, just really anchoring us down, and it really represents our origins and our roots. And so the IC is our baseline, representing our family and our roots and our home and our ancestors, and it's also our comfort zone, and the part of us that doesn't change, because it really defines us on a very genetic and cellular level. We can't change our parents, and we can't change our DNA or our genetics. So this is kind of the core of who we are, as opposed to the qualities that we develop throughout our life, being that MC. And this house also represents our emotional foundations, and the things and experiences and people that really shaped our emotional foundations. And so this is the house all about our family. And so this is a house all about our inner sense of emotional security and what we need in order to feel emotionally secure. And so this house also represents our home, and what that feels like. What does home feel like? And what qualities do you need in order to feel you're safe and secure and your home? And this is also being the house of family. It's also what does that feel like to belong to a group? And so, like I've been saying, it's a house that's like about our home and what does home feel like, but it's also like our physical home as well. And like, how do you want your house to be in order to feel secure in your environment? And then that brings us to the fifth house. And the fifth house represents everything that happens after we kind of establish our roots and we have a sense of safety in that fourth house. And so this fifth house is all about like, joy and play and fun and creative self-expression. And so this house is all about like how we express ourselves and it's how we like to spend our free time. And so that includes like our special interests and our hobbies and what kind of hobbies and how you do these things and how you have fun and how you express yourself in that process is described by the sign on this house cusp. So this is like the house of how we like to have fun and how we like to play, and it's just this house that's all about like joy. And so this is where you can find like your inner child in your chart. This is also a house all about risk-taking and gambling and romance and dating and sex, all that fun stuff. And the kind of dating that's in this house is not really like that person that you've been dating for years and years and years, that'll be more like seventh house relationships, but this is kind of like, you're just starting to date. And so it's kind of like there's this era of like excitement and there's like, passion and it just feels like new and exciting and risky and fun, it's not like you've had any like real fights or arguments yet. And then this is also the house of children because, being the house of, creative self-expression, our children are like our ultimate creations. And so it's how you are with children, whether it's like your own or other people's, but it's also like how you like to parent your children. And these qualities also tend to describe our children in some way. And then that brings us to the sixth house. And this is the house of work, health, and service, and our daily routines and our rituals. And so it's kind of like this house is like our everyday life, really. And so the sign on this house cusp tends to describe like what you do for your everyday work. And, that's kind of why like the second and sixth house are trying to each other because it's like, it flows from one into the next. And so it can be like your work life or your occupation. And, it's really your day job that brings home that daily bread. It doesn't always represent like your higher calling or your career in that 10th house, although, sometimes it can if there's like a connection there. But, this is usually just like, your job that you do every day that brings home that daily bread. This is also the house of health, and so it's how you approach your health routines, whether it's like, daily exercise and your daily hygiene and just how you take care of your physical body on a daily basis because, how you care for yourself and take care of your body on an everyday basis really impacts your health. Like if you're working yourself to the bone every day and you're not like moving your body and exercising or eating those foods that are healthy and nourishing to you, then, it'll make you sick eventually. But if you're doing those things that are good for yourself and you're taking steps every day to honor your health and take good care of yourself, that shows up as well. And so this is a house all about like our daily routines and our rituals and our habits and, just those things that we do on a daily basis that help us to improve ourselves and improve our lives or, not improve our lives. And so, this is also a house all about self-improvement. And being the house of service, this is also like how we like to help others and how we like to be of service to others and offer our skills. And it's also where we accept help from others as well. And speaking of others, that actually brings us to the next house, being the seventh house of relationships and partnerships and our commitments to others. The entry into the seventh house is the descendant. And so it's that sign that was setting in the sky on that western horizon at the moment that you were born. And so this is a house that's all about those close one-on-one relationships. And so it includes, but it's not limited to, our spouses and our business partners and like our best friends and our roommates and, those people that we're doing life with, really. It's also like our attitudes to relationships and partnerships in general. Like if you've got Sagittarius there, do you need a little bit of freedom in your relationships? It may also describe like what you're looking for in any kind of partner as well. Or, it may even be like these qualities that you're unconsciously attracting in your relationships. It's really where you're sharing your energy with another person mutually. And, mutually is the key word here because it's where, the seventh house is where we aim to find equality. This house is also how we like to commit our time and energy to others. And so this includes like our obligations and our agreements and like those written contractual relationships. And then that brings us to the 8th house. And this is where we transform through these deep and personal one-on-one relationships. And so again, it's where things get a little bit more deep and a little more intimate, and things start to get a little more like enmeshed or entangled. There's like this sense of like two become one here. And so this is a house all about like trust and support and how you support others as well as receive support. And so, that can be emotionally, like, psychologically as well, but it can also be like, other kinds of resources like monetary support from, investments or, inheritances. But even with inheritances, it's not always money. It could even be like, personality traits from a grandparent that you've never met, or, just traits that have been passed down that you've somehow inherited. And, it could even be like other like psychic gifts or, psychic abilities, because this house is all about the occult as well. And that includes like, beyond the veil and like the mysteries and, those witchy things, because it is a house that's all about sharing and dealing with the unknown. And so that includes like magic and witchcraft and all those occult subjects and like the mysteries in general and like, psychology and secrets, those things that are not very obvious on the surface. This is also a house that deals with like taboo subjects, and that includes death, because, people don't really like to talk about death in this culture that we live in. And so this is a house all about regeneration and deep transformation and how you deal with death and how you deal with grief and, how you let go and your attitude towards death and loss in general. And so this is a house that, we learn to alchemize the hard shit that we go through, and then it's how we evolve and grow and change through these experiences. And then as we move from the 8th house into the 9th house, this is where we take like the hard shit that we've gone through and we take those experiences and we turn it into wisdom. And so the 9th house is where you can find like, higher education and journeys and adventures and interactions with like, foreign cultures and, all things that broaden our horizons, both mentally and physically. And, those things that really foster growth and just really expands like our mental outlook. And so again, this is a house of higher education and long distance travel, and it's like, our philosophies and our beliefs. Again, this is the house where we gain wisdom through, experiencing life. This is also where you can find your visions and your goals, because, in order to find success in that next house, being the 10th house, we need to first be able to envision it. And so it's like, where do you want to go next? And what's the next adventure? And what kind of adventures do you like? So this house represents like all the experiences and pursuits and learning and wisdom that really lays the foundation for us to reach our full potential in that 10th house. And so again, this is a house where we're gaining experience and gaining wisdom and just expanding our understanding of the wider world. And then that brings us to the 10th house. And the entry into that 10th house is the MC. That line right there is the MC, or the midheaven, and it represents the highest point in our chart. And so it's like our most public space. And so if we go back to like that meridian line that links the IC and the MC, in that 4th house again, it's like our roots that are anchoring us down. And then in this 10th house, it's kind of like, those highest branches on a treetop. And so it represents, what we are growing into throughout our lives. And like, it's like our highest aspirations and ambitions in life. And so this 10th house, it's like our highest calling in life, and it governs our career and our vocation and our avocation, like that thing that we feel like we never want to retire from. And it's like our lifelong career. And it's just like what you really want to do with your life. And, not everybody lives up to like that highest calling or like that midheaven, because, not everybody can, not everybody has that ambition to pursue that 10th house calling. And so that midheaven also represents these qualities that we consciously develop throughout our lives, because like we find them desirable, as opposed to those qualities that we are born with in that IC. And so the 10th house being, like the top of those tree branches, like this is a very visible part in our chart, as opposed to the IC, which is like a very private part of ourselves. And so this is like, our public image and our reputation. And then as we move into that 11th house, coming after that 10th house, this is everything that happens after we kind of like discover our higher calling and our avocation in the world. And so this is the house where we feel the drive to share and implement our vision, and usually in a group of like-minded people. And so this is a house all about like our groups and our communities and our networks and our wider group of friends and our acquaintances that can kind of help us reach our higher ambitions in the world. It's in that 10th house where it's like we're trying to reach like this worldly success, and it's a house all about like our personal ambitions. And so in this 11th house, it's far less focused on personal ambition, and we're more inclined to try and manifest our vision and our hopes and our dreams and our inspirations and our aspirations through collaboration and teamwork. And so in this 11th house is where we collaborate with others and, share that 10th house ideal with a broader audience, because this is a house also about our audience. And so this is a house where you can find like your hopes and your dreams and your wishes and your aspirations for the future. And, you need a community in order to kind of like manifest that. And, there's nothing wrong with that. Nobody is an island. And so, yeah, this is just like where we collaborate with others to, hopefully manifest our dreams for the future. And then finally, that brings us to the 12th house. And the 12th house is a very deeply, deeply spiritual space. And it's also a house of endings, but it's also a house of like incubation. This is a house all about like our spiritual connection and our spiritual beliefs. And so it's in this house where we feel like deeply connected to ourselves and deeply connected to others and deeply connected to the collective and deeply connected to the universe. And so it's a deeply spiritual space. And being that house that is above the first house of self, I kind of always view this house as being like, the house of our higher self, that house that is above ego. And so this isn't really like a tangible house unless you've got like, an earth sign on this house cusp. But, it's kind of like what we can't see in ourselves. It's kind of like our blind spot, but it's also what we can grow and develop into throughout the course of our lives. And so this is like our subconscious and like the things that we're not even aware that are like a part of us. And so that includes like our unconscious patterns that we tend to play out over and over again that we don't even realize we're doing. And so it's those things that can be like self-limiting, whether they're, thoughts or behaviors or addictions or like self-sabotage, or like maybe you're like me and you like to isolate yourselves. But, this is also the house of isolation as well, because this is the house of feeling like deeply connected. It's kind of like on that same coin. It's also where we feel deeply disconnected and where we isolate ourselves and we give into those self-sabotaging thoughts or behaviors. So if you find yourself feeling like really disconnected from others, or you notice that you're isolating or you're cutting yourself off from others, really try to engage with the sign and the qualities that are on this house cusp and like try to address these issues, because if you want to grow and evolve as a person, this is where it can be like a deeply connected and transcendent space. Because this is really the part of ourselves that's like ethereal and spiritual rather than like our physical body. It's our transcendent self, it's our higher self. And so it's a very mystical space and very imaginative and dreamy and spiritual space. This is the space that we go like when we're meditating, or if you're an artist, it's where you go when you're like deeply in the flow of creating. And like if you're a musician, it's where you create from. This is like where the muse sits, and it's where we surrender to the flow and we move with the energy and we just like connect to the all that is. It's just like where we feel like deeply tuned in and tapped into that collective flow of energy, and it's where we create from, really. And being that space of incubation, the 12th house is where we are before we incarnate. We're in our mother's womb and then we are born, and that's how we move from that 12th house into that first house again. And so 12th house is also like, it represents endings, but with endings come new beginnings. And so again, you have every single sign in your chart, and how you approach each of these houses and each of these areas of life is described by the sign that is on that house cusp. And every planet in your birth chart also sits in one of these 12 houses, showing where that energy just naturally manifests in your life. And remember, there's no such thing as empty houses, because you still have a sign on a house cusp and a planet rules that sign. And so if you want to get more advanced, or if you want to take things like even a step further, then, looking into the ruler of that sign that is on that house cusp, and, what house that planet is sitting in. And, that kind of tells you more about how you approach that area of life. And it really kind of like connects those houses, and, it tends to come through that house. And, that's a topic for another day, because, I've already been yapping long enough, but that's just like if you want to, get more advanced and take things a step further. Okay, so now that we know where everything lands and, we understand the different areas of life, let's talk about how it all communicates and interacts with each other. Because, a chart isn't just like a bunch of planets sitting alone in a house, they're constantly in conversation with each other. And so those conversations are known as aspects in astrology. They are literally the angles that the planets make to each other in the sky from Earth's perspective. And so going back to my play analogy, if the planets are the actors and the signs are the character or the costume or the lens, and the houses are, the stage and the sets where all the action is happening, then it's like the aspects are like, the conversations between the planets, and it's like, the conversations between the characters and the relationships between the characters and the dialogue that's happening. Like, do these characters get along? Are they friends? Are they enemies? Do they tolerate each other? Are they able to find a way to work together? Or do they just kind of feel like they butt heads and there's constant tension between them? All of that can be found in the aspects in astrology and the relationships between the planets and the points. And so some aspects in astrology are harmonious and they flow easily and effortlessly, while others create tension. But, in that tension, that's what pushes us to grow a lot of times. And so when you pull up a birth chart, you'll notice these lines in the middle that kind of like, look like a spider web or just like a tangled mess of lines. Those are the aspects, but you may also see an aspect table depending on, what kind of program or site you're using. But what they really show, these angles between the planets, they really show the geometric relationship between the planets in the sky from Earth's perspective. Because remember, a birth chart is a circle. And for my, geometry people out there, a circle is 360 degrees. And so that means that our chart is 360 degrees. And so that makes sense when you think about it, because there are 12 signs in the zodiac, and, each one is 30 degrees. And what's 12 times 30? 360. And, early astrologers and astronomers, they used to be the same thing, but, early astrologers knew this, and, that's why there are 12 signs, because it just mathematically makes sense. Obviously there are way more than just 12 constellations in the sky, but, astrologers, I'm not really sure how they came up with, the zodiac and how they did it, but 12 is what is divisible by 360. And so 12 is kind of like a magic number in astrology. And so going back to the geometry in astrology, so these aspects between two planets or, angles or other points in astrology are all a certain degree away from each other. And so depending on that distance between these points and planets will tell us the relationship between these planets and points. And so I'll be covering the major aspects today. I believe that they're known as like the Ptolemaic aspects, named after Ptolemy. But if you're an astrologer like Rick Levine, he uses aspects known as harmonic aspects, which kind of like delve even deeper into the relationship between these points and planets. But for the sake of time, and since this is just kind of like a introductory video, I'll just be sticking to the major aspects. So let's start off with a conjunction. And so a conjunction is when two planets or points are sitting right next to each other, and it's kind of like their energies blend and they fuse, and it's like where two voices become one. And so this is where it's like, their energies combine and blend, and it becomes a really powerful and potent part in a birth chart. And it can be like, super powerful and super intense depending on what planets are involved. Whenever I see a conjunction in someone's chart, I'm going to know that this is an area of emphasis, because, depending on what planets are involved, again, it can be, it's an area of amplification and just like a really potent part in a chart. And so it's like a strong energetic focus in the chart, and it's just like this area of amplification again. And so when planets are conjunct, they are in the same sign. And so that sign is coming out super strong in this individual. But, planets can be conjunct that are, like let's say you have a planet at 29 degrees and another one at 0 degrees of the next sign. Like, those are still pretty close, but, they're in different signs, so that amplification won't be, experienced exactly the same because they're expressing through different signs. So like the amplification isn't as strong as if it was like, if they're like right on top of each other. And so actually, let's talk about orbs. So for conjunctions, I tend to give like a 7 to 8 degree orb. I don't usually do anything above 10 degrees, but the closer the planets are to each other, the stronger that conjunction will be expressed. And then that brings us to sextiles, and sextiles are planets or points that are 60 degrees away from each other, giving an 8 to 0 degree orb. And this kind of brings like a friendly conversation between two planets or points where there's just like a sense of ease and just like a natural sense of flow. And it tends to bring like this supportive energy where it's like the two planets are supporting each other in their expression. They tend to act as like these gentle and helpful nudges rather than like a shove, like you're being shoved out the door. It's just kind of like this supportive energy, kind of like, a cheerleader, kind of, urging you on. And so sextiles tend to bring opportunities between planets, and there's just like this feeling of like easy cooperation and just like a natural sense of flow where it's like, things just click. These planets tend to get along. They're friends. And then next we have the square, and when two planets are square each other, that means that they are 90 degrees away from each other. And a square can feel almost like a tense, standoff between planets that can feel really like challenging and gritty and just kind of like frustrating sometimes. But it's this tension and like this friction and this feeling like there's a challenge that really pushes you to take action and ultimately grow. And so squares come from planets that are in the same modality. And so modalities, again, they're the cardinal, fixed, and mutable signs. And so like if you've got planets that are in different cardinal signs, like they're going to square off with each other. And so squares are usually these things that you can't really ignore in your chart, and you usually feel tension. And when things feel tense, you have to find an outlet and you have to find ways to relieve that tension, and you have to get creative and innovate as well. And so this is a creative aspect because it's usually that like these challenges that are described by the square between two planets that really leads to innovation. And so I always explain squares as being like this creation through frustration. And so, people that have a lot of squares in their chart are usually very creative people. And, these are the people who have had to find ways to get creative and innovate in their lives because, they probably haven't had the most easy life. And these are the people that usually tend to go pretty far in life because, these are the people that have dealt with, they've had like these inner tensions and these challenges and these adversities that they've had to go through and overcome throughout their life in order to grow. And so, yeah, these people, they know how to kind of get through the hard shit, really. And then next we have the trine, which is 120 degrees. And so planets that are trine are in the same element. And so, all the water signs are trine, all the air, all the fire, all the earth. And trines are just like this smooth, effortless, natural flow of energy that tend to show like our natural talents and our gifts and just things that come easy to us. And, it kind of makes sense when you think about it with like, how planets that are trine that are in the same element, because like, for example, all the water signs are, like they're water. And so they have like this understanding of, each other on a very foundational level. And so that like effortless flow of energy just kind of makes sense. And so this is like this unrestricted energy flow where you don't have to do anything with the energy. It just kind of flows. It's kind of like, imagine like water flowing down a slide or, a river without a dam. It just flows. And so it's just like this natural flow without any amount of effort. And so again, it can show like these natural talents and abilities that you have, but when you just are naturally good at something, like sometimes you can also take this energy for granted. And then that brings us to the opposition, which is 180 degrees apart. So if you understand, geometry, half of 360 is 180. And so these are planets that are sitting directly opposite each other. And so there's this need to try and balance the opposing energies. And so sometimes these are planets that can feel like, they're facing off against each other, and they might feel like, almost a tug of war. And so part of like learning to work with the energy of an opposition is learning to find a balance and balance that spectrum and balance that polarity. And so when you think about like an opposition, like if you're thinking about like the ascendant and the descendant, like, you know, it's not like one cancels out the other, but it's rather it's like bringing awareness through others and through balancing those opposing energies. Again, it's a polarity. And so it can show up as like these external challenges or situations or external people and just external tensions, but it's really like trying to mirror back that energy and learning to find a balance between these energies. And so these are the major aspects in astrology. Again, the Ptolemaic aspects. And so again, just like imagine that all the planets are like, you know, in a group chat almost, where it's like, you know, some are like best friends and others are just kind of like tolerating each other, and some argue and some are kind of like it's complicated. And so just every aspect, keep in mind, every aspect has a nuance depending on, you know, what planets are involved. And aspects just add like another layer of interpretation and another layer of nuance to your birth chart. And so that also adds to how like no two charts are exactly the same. And so now that I have yapped and yapped and yapped, let's put it all together. And so we've got these basic building blocks of astrology that are like the astrological ABCs or do-re-mis, however you want to think about it. And so first we have the planets, and the planets are the what of astrology, like what part of your consciousness and what part of your psyche and, you know, what urge or desire or need is being expressed. Remember, think of them as the actors in this play of life, and each actor has a very important role in your life. And then we have the signs, and the signs are the how in astrology, like how is a planet expressing itself and what qualities does a sign express itself through? You know, the signs are descriptors and these archetypal energies. Again, think of them as like, you know, they're these characters that a planet is playing, and you could think of it as like a filter or a lens or, you know, the costume that a planet is wearing. And so like, how is the planet flavored, or how is the area of life, being the house, how is it being approached? And that is described by the sign it's sitting in. And so let's take the moon, for example, like the moon being our emotions. And so depending on what sign it's sitting in will describe how you express your emotions. So like, do you express them like boldly and fiery and impatiently like Aries, or do you express them in a more like quick and communicative and, you know, cerebral way and a curious way like Gemini? And then, like we talked about today, the houses are the where in astrology. Like, where do these planet and sign combinations show up most in your life? And where does this energy express itself? And, you know, where are you being called to focus and express this energy the most in your life? And, you know, where does this energy manifest the most in your life? And then the aspects, again, it's how everything communicates. And, you know, aspects are kind of like another layer of interpretation, just adding an extra flavor to how these planetary energies express themselves in your life. And so when you put all of this together, like try to imagine that like your birth chart is like this orchestra where there's many parts that work together to create like a beautiful symphony that is you. Where it's like, you know, each planet could be like a different instrument in this orchestra that is, you know, playing a certain tune or a certain harmony or a certain melody. And, you know, the sign could also describe like, you know, what musical style is that planet playing in? And then, you know, the houses, think about the houses as when like a certain instrument comes through strongest at like the most prominent time or whatever. You know, it's not like you hit a drum during an orchestra the whole time. You know, it has a specific time when it comes in. And so that could be like, you know, where the house is, or it could also be like, you know, the venue that an orchestra is playing in, or like, you know, what kind of stage. Is it more of like an intimate setting, or is it like Carnegie Hall, or, you know, like Broadway? You know, there's lots of different ways that you could think about like the houses. And then the aspects show like what instruments like sound good together and that create this like this sound of harmony, and which ones play at different times. Not my best analogy, but the general, like the idea is that like all of these parts kind of work together, and they combine together to form your birth chart and ultimately to describe you. And so in this Astrology 101 Part 1 and Part 2, it's like I've just given you like those basic building blocks of astrology and given you the astrology ABCs and do, re, mi's. And so what you do with these building blocks or these ABCs, like do you want to create like these long novels, or like with the do, re, mi's, do you want to create like, your own music and like, the novels, or like, creating your own songs and your own music. That is like the chart synthesis. That's like, the artistic side of astrology, because there is a lot to astrology. And so when you have like a really solid and strong foundation and you really understand like these basic building blocks in astrology, that really sets the tone to be able to, develop your own chart synthesis style. And there's also like an intuitive side to it as well. And so like another analogy, like in this Part 1 and Part 2, it's like I have kind of like, if you think about, your astrology chart as like, soup or like something like that, what I've done is just kind of like given you those ingredients. And so for you, it's kind of like you have to add the broth, and then you have to add like the vegetables, and you have to add your protein, and then you have to mix it all together and turn like, put it on like the stovetop and actually cook it. And like the stirring is like the chart synthesis. And so once you really can understand like these basic building blocks again, is when you can really start actually reading charts and not just memorizing keywords. You start to actually like feel the chart and embodying the chart, and you can really see the story and the psychology and like the dynamics and like the nuance in every single chart. And that's actually when astrology tends to like work the best, when it's a combination of like, the intellectual side, where it's like you've done your studies and you understand these basic foundations, and then you combine like the creative side and the artistic side and also the intuitive side. And so that's when astrology really works the best, is when you can kind of like read it like a story, and like, it's not a chart, but it's a person sitting in front of you. And you're not just like listing out these traits, but you can really just like fully understand the archetypes and the energies. Because every chart really tells a story, and it really tells a story of like a soul evolution, learning to integrate all of its different parts. And so if Part 1 was like the ingredients in the soup, then it's like Part 2, I've kind of given you the recipe, but what you do with these ingredients and this recipe is really up to you. And so hopefully now like you've got another layer of, deeper understanding. And so you can actually see how everything in your chart actually comes alive and interacts with each other. And so this has been the basic building blocks in astrology, or the Astrology 101. And I tried to break things down in a way that makes sense, that like, young astrologer Mackenzie would have liked to be, had things explained to. And if you haven't watched Part 1 yet, be sure to go back and watch that, and watch my rising sign video. And if you also want like a visual guide, then be sure to join my Patreon, where you get access to that Astrology 101 ebook. And if you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them down below. I love answering questions, and I hope that this made sense. And if you've stuck with me so far, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. And yeah, until next time, love you, bye.